Okay, welcome back to the conference on intentional communities. And first of all, we have Renny Hahamovitch, who, if I can, uh, will be talking about his work on the future without limits, colonialism without guilt, the L5 society, and dreamer of utopian space capitalism.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for the wonderful conference organizers and to Professor Ginger for chairing. Okay, the future is canceled. This has been a rallying cry among some leftist thinkers like Mark Fisher in the past decade. The future, here not simply the sense of our movement through time, right, but rather our mental projection of what the future society will look like has eroded, so the argument goes. The ability to imagine a positive, far-off future was a symptom of Fordist capitalist production of the 20th century and was slowly picked away by consumer capitalism, financialization, the decline of the welfare state, neoliberalism, in other words. This, quote, slow cancellation of the future, as theorized by Franco Berardi and other scholars, has left us with, on one hand, the recognition that society is changing all the time. It's obvious that technology is accelerating every day and it's constantly reshaping our lives, cell phones, the internet, right? But on the other hand, it's left us with the simultaneous inability to create new forms of expression unique to the 21st century. In Simon Reynolds' words, everyday life has sped up, but culture has slowed down. We have become paralyzed politically and culturally, unable to plan for a long-term future or to imagine a future other than dystopia. As Mark Fisher writes, the dimension of the future has disappeared. We are trapped in the 20th century. Now, some have called for a rebellion against this narrow ring of human possibility through reclaiming the utopian imaginaries of the 20th century left, to revitalize a decaying leftist political movement, or whatever, and the politics of the future that it once so powerfully expressed. Now, I'm a historian of space exploration in the US and the Soviet Union, and what interests me in particular about this topic is the fact that for a brief time in the 20th century, it became possible for both capitalist and socialist societies to politically, culturally, and industrially organize around a future that was very far away. We've benefited a lot from space exploration, obviously, through satellite communications, GPS, but few of those benefits were obvious when space exploration began. People went to orbit into the moon not primarily because it would benefit them particularly at that moment, but because of a deep sense that they were building something that future generations would benefit from many years later. I think it's a hard thing to grasp now in our own political moment. Our society seems unable to shift politically even a little, despite the oncoming environmental and economic collapse in the future. Like with the broader futurism that Fisher and others point to, space futurism also seemed to mostly collapse with the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s. While I generally agree with this argument for reclaiming the future, today I want to argue for a slightly different narrative. I believe that it is not quite true that the future has been canceled. Rather, I think neoliberalism brought a shift in who is able to imagine the future and to organize around it politically. While in much of the 20th century, the future was an essential mode of politics and culture that was evident in many places, I believe now it has become mostly secluded to elite circles of capitalists and to neoliberal thinkers. The future went from being a public to being a private affair, and while before the future was an arena for politics across the political spectrum, but particularly on the left, I think futurism and utopianism have now primarily become a realm for the neoliberal right wing. Today I'm going to point to a group of thinkers, entrepreneurs, and space enthusiasts in America that came about in the 1970s after the decline of space exploration and precisely during the rise of neoliberalism. This loosely affiliated group was called the L5 Society, and it was a sort of special interest group that lobbied for free business enterprise in outer space. They wanted to build a utopian capitalist community of space colonists on board gigantic city-sized space stations in orbit. Through a small group, they ended up being very influential for American space policy and created the conditions for the so-called second space race, going on now among capitalists like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They're extremely utopian. None of their ideas ever came close to being carried out. They were also intensely neoliberal and pragmatic, identifying themselves with a new brand of anti-big government capitalism that would transcend nations and, in their case, the Earth itself. They came up with a lot of far-sighted and at the time heterodox ideas about how to run a space society, which obviously never went anywhere, but have now become essential to neoliberal life on Earth, I believe. So I think this history demonstrates the ways in which neoliberalism can be a highly futuristic movement. So the L5 Society was founded in the 1970s to support the space colonization plan of Princeton physicist Gerard O'Neill, here on the left. O'Neill was an expert in high-energy physics and an eccentric thinker who dressed a bit like a Star Trek character. Reacting to the infamous limits of growth thesis of the Club of Rome in 1972 that predicted that human society would soon run out of resources, O'Neill theorized a dramatic plan for space colonization that would, all at once, open up limitless resources to mankind, solve the energy crisis, and answer the growing Malthusian sense that overpopulation would destroy the planet. He designed a series of gigantic space stations, each of which would house 10,000 people at a minimum, that would carry solar energy in orbit and beam it back to Earth. Using resources from the moon, the first station would be built at the L5 point, a point in orbit where the gravitational forces of the Earth and the moon equal out. That station could build other stations, and those stations other stations, which could be sent out to colonize the galaxy. This was the first plan for space colonization that didn't involve colonizing planets, but rather building human environments directly in space, and that rapidly accelerated the theoretical timeline of space colonization. The first prototype, the L5 station, would have weighed over 500,000 tons, with space inside large enough for mountains and seas, and it would have been the largest, most expensive structure ever built. It would be a massive cylinder that would spin in orbit around the Earth, surrounded by a ring of agricultural pods conjoined to massive solar power stations. The inside of the cylinder would have its own artificial gravity and an Earth-like internal surface, with parkland and forests, lakes, rivers, grass, trees, animals, and birds. All of this, O'Neill was convinced, was feasible with the current state of technology and could be estimated realistically. In the early 1970s, he predicted that the US could begin construction as soon as 1981, and that the station could start beaming back energy in the early 1990s, achieve market penetration in a few years, and then replace all earthly energy by the 2000s. This plan, which the L5 Society and others further expanded upon, was sold as both economically pragmatic in that it could solve the energy crisis and was quite socially utopian. This prototype station could offer more than any earthly city, which O'Neill saw as rapidly decaying because of the urban crisis. He predicted that people would have simple spacecraft to use as recreational vehicles and would be able to ski, sail, mountain climb, and even hang glide on board the station. Noisier, polluting sports, such as auto racing, could be carried out in one of the cylinders of the external ring. There would also be movie theaters, restaurants, concerts, ballets, shops, hospitals, schools, churches, golf, zoos, free-roaming wildlife, and low-gravity swimming pools, alongside many other things. Though bound to Earth politically in some way, the stations would no doubt form their own small-scale governments, he believed, in the dispersed villages of the stations. Thinking back to the colonization of the Americas and the US expansion into the West, the L5ers assumed that, like colonists of old, these space colonists would be individualist, freedom-loving frontiersmen dedicated to progress and the pursuit of private property. In such a free frontier as space, the governments they would form would no doubt also be freedom-loving, entrepreneurial, and peaceful communities with minimal conflict and no need for quote-unquote big government. This new free frontier would also help alleviate what they saw as a drug-riddled, purposeless, and anti-technology social movements spawned in the 1960s. The energy provided by the stations would not only preserve the rich economic lifestyle of the industrialized West, but also help lift the third world out of poverty through limitless energy and by absorbing population surplus. The technology and scientific growth that the space frontier would open up would bring, quote, moderation and empathy alongside technological maturity, and allow for infinite growth in the galaxy. This was colonialism, O'Neill wrote, but this time there were no hostile Indians to deal with. Rather, he said, we can colonize space, and we can do so without robbing or harming anyone, and without polluting anything. Inspired by O'Neill's ideas and looking to benefit from the disintegration of the US space program at the same time, many people jumped on this opportunity and formed many space companies, many of which are still around today. By facilitating this revolution of free enterprise in space, rather than pursuing it solely as a federal program, the United States, they argued, could return to its traditional role as a generous donor of wealth to those in need, resolving the growing hostility towards it from poorer countries. O'Neill's space station would provide, in his words, energy without guilt. So here we see many of the causes that spawned neoliberalism as it first appeared in the United States in the 1970s. Instead of the white flight of the white middle class from cities to suburbs and the resulting dilapidation of urban life, the L5 Society imagined a flight off the planet entirely, into a more utopian but still very much suburban setting aboard the space stations. Like in the neoliberal project as a whole, the L5 Society also expressed a deep need for protection and the expansion of individuality and individual property ownership against the looming evil threat of big government, understood broadly. Finally, there was a broad distrust of Cold War politics and its world. Here, it wasn't geopolitical strategies or big budget proxy wars that would fight communism and raise up the third world, but the simple forces of the market unrestrained and given an influx of unlimited resources. How much time is there for the... Plenty? Okay. So I think these are the causes of neoliberalism that grow into the L5 project that we can see reflected in it. But in terms of results, I think we see a lot of what neoliberalism later became, taking some of its first steps in the thinking of the L5 Society. Although O'Neill and other supporters of the L5 station constantly expressed this utopian sense of how wonderful and joyous life would be up on board their space station, they also acknowledged the need to control their new utopia. For one, there seemed to be a clear danger that some colonists would go insane. The curvature of the station, the isolation of space, and the artificiality of the landscape might cause them deep psychological stress. Solipsism syndrome, the belief that everything around you is artificial and that there is no reality beyond your own mind, was one possible concern. Therefore, it was essential that the station not be sterile. The designers had to avoid motel banality by creating an artificial unpredictability. The habitat had to be artfully designed to look natural, not man-made. Overall, the humans of the station had to be given the appearance of choice, the illusion of nature, to pacify their minds and to keep them working and productive. But ultimately, everything in the station would be virtually monitored and controlled by supercomputers, making sure that all the systems were in order, including the humans. There was also a fear that people in the space station wouldn't have too much power to strike. In answer to this concern, one space enthusiast in the Rand Corporation argued for making sure that part of the investment in the space station came out of the wages of the space colonists themselves, to make them stakeholders in a sort of broader enterprise. Thus, if fired, they wouldn't just lose their occupation, but also their home and their lifestyle, reducing their working power. The L5ers also argued that the station should remain artificially economically dependent on Earth to reduce the likelihood of them declaring independence, making sure they never had the capacity to manufacture everything that they would need, and in a sense treating the stations as a third world country, stuck in an extractive relationship with the developed West. But the stations would be kept on a fairly loose rein, in O'Neill's words, as long as productivity and profits remained high, the highest priority. There were more extreme ideas as well. One L5 member, who was himself a prisoner in the Florida penitentiary system at the time, argued that prisoners would make the best colonists, because they were cheaper and desperate. He came up with a system essentially for space indentured servitude, that is, voluntary slavery, for a future freedom in the colony. The prisoner has developed new frontiers in the past and will do it again, he wrote. The lunar environment is hostile, and Florida's large death row has prisoners who are willing to go. Of course, there was a fair amount of disagreement among the L5 Society and other interested parties. For instance, one of the L5 plan supporters was Timothy Leary, a celebrity sort of Harvard psychologist who was famous in the 60s and 70s for advocating for psychedelic drugs and transhumanism. He was also in prison around this time. They saw the migration of humans to space as a genetic imperative. We have to transcend our larval state on this womb planet and reach a higher form of existence beyond our insectoid mentality on Earth. In the infinite expanse of Earth, the warlike nature of humans would fade away, he thought, into a more utopian and democratic free association of peoples. Meanwhile, another associate of the society, Captain Robert Freytag of NASA, who was an army guy, was interviewed alongside Leary, and was also optimistic about space colonization, but less about the democracy part. Space colonization is a highly disciplined thing, he wrote. Certain concepts of freedom are gone when you get into space migration. It's got to be a dictatorship to start out with. You just can't have a welfare operation in space. But despite their different predictions and very different backgrounds, Leary and Freytag found room to agree on this topic. The real problem for both of them was bureaucracy and big government. It was important to leave those behind on Earth when going to space. The real emphasis had to be free enterprise. This is the thread that weaves this grand utopian vision together, the pioneering of space through free business enterprise. Here we see the unlimited ambition of the neoliberal imagination expressing the very same sentiment as Ronald Reagan would in a few years when he intoned that it was his goal to get the government off people's backs. Though it faded in intensity for a while, it's still the same impulse that's driving Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos now in their pursuit to colonize Mars. Get the government off our backs, this time millions of miles away. Of course, both then and now, the rebellion against big government is just an illusion. Both the L5 station and the second space race of today speak in libertarian language, but demand enormous government expenditure, just without government control. I think this is one example of how the future wasn't canceled, it was stolen, now only a realm of the most rich and most powerful. Though now incorporated into other organizations, the utopianism of the L5 society has very much become a part of the space scheming of people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who are very much closer to actually undertaking such a project than their predecessors were in the 1970s. What does this mean for us? I think that it means we have to recognize how the future has not disappeared. Utopianism has not disappeared. It has been taken over by the right wing. But also that's not enough simply to imagine our own oppositional futures. One of the most remarkable features of neoliberalism is its ability to incorporate and disempower seemingly contradictory politics. Here, for instance, the psychedelic hippie Leary and the authoritarian military nut Freytag, both supporting the same utopian project. But this kind of political contradiction was emblematic of the whole L5 society itself. As one senator who supported the project described it, the society was made up of radical, energetic youths of the 1960s, led by senior officials of industry, whose hallmarks are restraint, caution, and conservatism. Opposing such a dynamic and, I think, consuming ideology requires engaging with the future in a way as dedicatedly political as they were to free enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to go now to Romania, to Sorin Antohi. And if you'll forgive my pronunciation, the Romanian Phalanstery Scăieni, is it? 10th of March, 1835 to 31st December, 1836.
Your pronunciation was great, by the way. Thank you very much. Buenos días, señoras y señores. Estoy muy contento de hablar en este congreso. Me gustaría agradecer a los organizadores por invitarme. But I will speak English because I speak it better. And you know, Spanish spoken with Romanian accent, you just have to go out there in the streets and learn. We go back almost 200 years in time, and in space we go to Romania. I returned myself to this topic after 40 years. My first take on this story was more critical, as it was directed against the utopia I was living in at the time, which was the Socialist Republic of Romania. Now I read the same story in a more compassionate way, and just I'm looking at the, let's say, more human and humane aspects of this story, but I still have to tell it. The hero of this story is a guy, Theodor Diamand, who was Fourier's Romanian disciple. He lived for about 31 years, between 1810 to 1841, studied in Romanian and other languages, Greek, German, French. He knew also Italian, studying in Bucharest, Munich, where he was at the cadet school with great results. Then he moved to Paris. These years in Paris, from 1830 to 1834, were crucial in his development because he simply abandoned his, let's say, encyclopedic and pragmatic projects with which he had left Romania, and he embarked on a truly utopian agenda. First, through his contacts with the guys around Saint-Simon and his writings. Then, after seeing that there was something better on offer in Paris, he went and joined the Fourier disciples. He actually met Fourier and had also correspondence with him. And he decided to simply go back to Romania after having learned all the skills and the theories that he needed to build up Phalanstery in his native country. Well, of course, he got even more ambitious. I will spare you the details, but he got even more ambitious on the way. And after failing, I have to disclose that, in the making of a perfect Phalanstery, he also suggested to the ruling prince of the neighboring Romanian Principality of Moldavia the Phalansterization of the principality by means of, of organizing the gypsy state slaves into phalansteries. So in this way, he was also giving references to Latin America, of course. He was a fan of Francia, of the dictator of Paraguay. He knew the history of the reducciones. He knew about other things that were mentioned here in the previous 2 days. So, and he simply put on paper fabulous, if you read it seriously, project to actually reorganize the whole world as a phalanstery. He, of course, believed in Fourier's principle of spontaneous, let's say, ontological contamination. Once you build the perfect standard phalanstery, the world will organize itself as a system of phalansteries. We remember that from the wonderful ideas, self-ironical, but also delirious, that Fourier was proposing. He was aware of this possibility, and so to persuade the ruling princes of the Romanian principalities in the 1840s, 30s, 40s, he was talking about the phalansterization of Africa, for instance, as a relatively more ambitious project. In comparison, what he wanted for Romania, for the Romanian principalities, seemed almost, let's say, pragmatic and realistic. Well, of course, he didn't make it. He couldn't put together the perfect phalanstery. He couldn't go and find the philanthropist that Fourier was also after, we remember, and Victor Considerant and others were always after. So he had to do it with modest means on a smaller scale. His ambitions are, however, interesting. Now, beyond the peculiarities of these more or less exotic Romanian example, speaking of Orientalism, of the Andalusians, well, think about the Orientalism when you talk about the Romanian lands, and then you will sober up a bit. Well, so when I talk about these issues here, and I retell very briefly this small history, I, of course, revisit a number of ideas, for instance, of a more general interest. For instance, what is an intentional community? How intentional, in fact, are intentional communities? For many members, of course, they are not really intentional. They are half intentional, they are maybe unintentional. Lots of people congregate around the project of an intentional community of all sorts. This is why a rather detailed history, anthropology, and sociology of any such project should be undertaken in order to understand not only the pull and push factors, but also issues such as the internal stratification, leadership, agency, free will, and all these issues that come together in order to build up the perfect society. So, in fact, I would rather be inclined to suggest another concept, the concept of intended community, something that you planned to do, or some people plan to do for themselves, sometimes only for others, sometimes for themselves and others. So this is a more complex notion than we first think. And this is why intentional communities should be really read historically, sociologically, anthropologically, against the background of their larger societies at their time. Now, what was going on in the Romanian principalities in 1828 was this. The principalities were leaving the Orient of the Ottoman Empire due to a sudden, unexpected Russian occupation. Now, the Russian troops were led by extremely widely read and ambitious quasi-utopian senior officers, including generals, who were trying to actually set up a kind of model or utopian version of the Tsarist administration wherever they could. And they only could, of course, on the peripheries of the system. We know it from Finland, you know that better, from the Grand Duchy of Finland, which was also a project which combines history and some streams of utopian planning. This was more the case in the Utopian Principality and the Romanian Principalities, which were supposed in the mind in the plans of some of the senior Russian generals to become a kind of earthly utopia. So they actually brought with them in 1828 a fully articulate system of, modernizing, and I would say utopianizing their largely rural, backward principalities. And this is why Theodor Diamand was smart enough to use this momentum when he returned from Paris. And he kept addressing the ruling princes who were Romanian, but were working under the, let's say, protection of these Russian peripheral reformers, military reformers. And so he was very careful to present his plans as just modest undertakings when compared to the huge, let's say, utopian project of modernizing the entire countries. So when he, before returning to Romania, he was, of course, fluent in French and in 5 other languages, in 4 other languages. And he wrote, actually, and published in Paris, a brochure, a booklet, which was, of course, a variation on Fourierist themes, and which he distributed graciously to whoever was interested. Apparently, not very many were interested, as you remember from the biography of Fourier himself. And of course, I will spare the details. These are, let's say, variations on Fourier classical topics. So I will just, and of course, he wouldn't forget to criticize fiercely guys such as Saint-Simon and Owen and others. But that we would, he picked up from Fourier also this kind of syllogistic hubris, this ambition to create a system that would rationally reproduce itself, not only set up itself through this kind of ontological contamination that I mentioned earlier, but would somehow be self-explanatory, would be so rational that everybody would immediately subscribe to it. Now, bringing this utopian blueprint home proved to be more difficult, and the history of this settlement in Scăieni is let's say, tragicomical attempt to build a Phalanstery about 85 kilometers north from Bucharest towards the mountains in a village. And then the discussion goes like this, if I have another 5 minutes. I do. Well, he teams up with people who were no utopianists, absolutely, but people from his family who are, let's say, lower level boyars, that is, landlords, who are heavily indebted, who had huge financial problems, and who saw in this project of the Phalanstery a break. They couldn't hope for anything better than that, because somehow they were supposed to use their own lands, which were, of course, had been sold several times to various buyers, to bring together a colony of about 50, 60 people whom they were recruiting all over the Principality. Very actively. Fourier was one, Diamand was one of them, his relatives were others. Diamand was actually very keen on getting the exact plans of the Phalanstery. He wrote about that to Fourier. We don't know Fourier's answer. He eventually got those exact plans from the architect Moritz. Then, of course, he discovered that this was not possible in Romania, but in any way. So then these citizens of the future had to be lured somehow differently, with allusion to Christian references they knew, to the kind of life they had. Let's say that this was a kind of millenarian Zionist for Romanians kind of propaganda, in which the end result would be a kind of ever-flourishing kind of kibbutz, a kind of colony in which people, yes, would have to learn, but moderately. And they will have plenty of almost everything, including education. There is a discussion about the promiscuity, which was somehow subtextually suggested. And there was some very interested people in the administration of the time who would take nice guided tours of the Phalanstery to meet some of the young ladies under 25, which was then the majority age in the maturity age, official maturity age. So he only got together about 50-something, about 53. Statistics vary because people would come and go. The result was that finally the whole thing collapsed. And of course, for all the beautiful rhetoric about all these people who had joined, I quote sometimes, of their own free will, dissatisfied with a life of servitude, urging each other to enter the Phalanstery and so forth, what resulted from this is that in the practice of about 20 months of actually living together in various formats on the estate, they very quickly discovered the need to have also a security guard organized, not necessarily to keep others out, but to keep, the Utopians in and to prevent them from seceding from this resplendent future. Life was, of course, according to the regulations, which are very interesting and detailed and preserved in the archives and are also published, was very carefully planned, detailed, so forth. It was almost a utopia. The only problem was it never came to be. So after this failure, as I mentioned, Diamand decided to try again with this huge project of the Phalansterization of the Gypsies. Again, a beautiful memoir which was sent to the ruling prince of the Principality of Moldavia, which very aptly and in fact, astutely used the very rhetoric and the very language and some of the very objectives of the organic regulations, which are the new legal quasi-constitutions which had been brought by the Russians. Now, the Russians came much later to Romania with a different utopian proposal, as you well know, and they tried a kind of, they pretended this was yet another case of large-scale intentional community. Not everybody agreed, as you might remember. There had been another attempt to build on the right and even on the extreme right a kind of intentional community, and that was the authoritarian, ethnic, anti-Semitic, hyper-nationalist ethnic state of Romania in the 1930s, which only existed for a very short period of time and only in the minds of its proponents mostly. But now, bringing it to a close, I would say that this extreme example from the outskirts of Europe of a utopian plan from the 1830s is a testimony to the extraordinary appeal that these projects, utopian projects, had for people from all over the place who were discovering the West on this exact occasion. So I would say that, and this remained in Romania for a long time, an approach that was simultaneously skeptical, incredulous, pessimistic, ironic, and self-ironic. And this is why Romanian utopianism never got hold. So it is just a collection of disparate, modest proposals, some of them crazy, some of them estimable. But I think the original sense that utopia was not a Romanian possibility, I think got rid of this kind of fantasies for the remaining 200 years of our history. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. We now go back to the room, as it were. We have Teuvo Peltoniemi, who's going to talk about Finnish utopian communities. Are you set up okay, Teuvo?
I have a quite demanding task, really, because I'm going to cover about 300 years and 20 Finnish communities in this time. My aim is actually to show that the Finnish utopian settlements have been following the main features of the big traditional and even recent communities, but with a delay of something, sometimes 20 years, sometimes even longer, and sometimes no delay at all. You can see from the map that Finns have been settled down for utopians all around the world, in reality, nearly on all continents. And to show it more exactly, so here you find that most of the Finnish utopian communities were in the North America, in the US and Canada. Quite a few also in the Spanish-speaking, in the tropical South America, also in Asian, close to Vladivostok, etc., in Australia, and even in Africa, a very early one. This map is simply to show that very often the normal kind of migration has been to the same countries, but much later than these utopian settlements were. I have divided these about 20 Finnish communities into 4 groups. Largest of them is socialism, if we include also cooperative communes in it. Relations were the first ones, and the Finnish nationalism has been not for many, but quite an important one. And on the 20s, 1920s, there were quite a few which were back to the countryside and vegetarianism and many of the features which are nowadays in intentional utopians. I don't have time to go very much including the details, but here if you look at the timeline, so the time span is really about 300 years. The first one which I have been found was already in 1734. That was the time of religions in Scandinavia. It used to be Finland was a very Protestant country at that time, but however the church has come an institution that was hated by many. They wanted to have more individual view, and so pietism is the word used at that time. Finland at that time was under the Swedish government. It was a part of Sweden. And of course, everything went through Sweden, and even in Finland, the Swedish was the main language, in the sense official main language. Finnish was the real one used by the most people. And it was a sect with about 100 people altogether who were doomed at the court for exile. They had to leave Finland, and it was a small piece of people from Finland who went then to Stockholm, and then they really had to leave the Sweden, Finland, and they were sailing. They were not rich, but had money to buy ships and so on, and they tried to get in Europe to places where they could be living with their own religion, which was meaning that the church was not really accepted. They wanted to have everything according to the book, the big book, and they were not given place in Europe really to live. They went to Denmark, they went to Germany, they went to different places in Netherlands. And only in Netherlands and in Germany they were able to stay about 1 year. And after that they were expelled from there. Then finally they came to Sweden, where they were living their life. But that was during the Swedish time, and also the next one, even more utopian by the idea, was in Sierra Leone in Africa, which of that time was not really anyone's white people's land, but the purpose was good. Finnish, Swedish and English persons, most of the noblemen, were wishing they were with anti-slave ideas and of enlightenment, and they wanted to free the slaves from the US and other places and bring them to Sierra Leone. The leader of that died very soon, so nothing really came out of that. But you remember that Liberia actually is based on the same kind of idea. Then we were, Sweden and Russian were in war, and Russian won, and so we were under the Russian regime for a while, for a long way, and then comes Strelok, which is close to the Vladivostok on the Pacific coast of Russia, and that was established by Finland's Swedish-speaking people, and they were testing communism, really. And I will show a few pictures of that later on. Then after that comes nationalist, the oppression of the Tsar. People were leaving Finland either to exile or voluntary, and they went to different places in the world. And then comes more or less the socialist time, when there are most of the Finnish communities, and then comes this back to the countryside, and then something very new one. But here I already told what happened with Ericsson's brothers. They were sailing 11 years and not really having, they lived in fact many years on the small boats they were sailing. And to the same place, to the same category is the one which was supposed to be in Sierra Leone, but did not success because of the death of the director. And then about the similaries, the newest one, which was which actually still is in Israel, it's a kibbutz Yad Hashmona. They went there because they wanted to help Israeli people, and they felt also that the Finnish people, the state of Finland, who had given some of the eight Jewish people to the Nazis, so it was kind of asking for excuse. And the Strelok one is one of the most, which I have been there 2 times, and I think I know it best. You can see that they were Helsinki and Turku, bourgeois people mostly, but they were fascinated by the communism idea that was living a little earlier, and they went to that place. One reason they went was that the Tsar wanted to have population there against China and Korea. So there were no taxes, no military service, etc. But it lasted only 1 winter. It was too strong winter. They were not able to live there. Some of them still live on this area. I mean, their descendants, but most of them came back to Finland. And then we come to the most famous or most remarkable and important things that the socialist-oriented one. 2 journalists, Matti Kurikka was a journalist and theosophist. He was also liking Jesus Christ and so on. So he went to Australia first. It was a time when Kurikka's socialists and the nationalist Finns, the bourgeois one, we are having debate on the press even, who is making the better kind of place for the Finns to live the Finland which was under the oppression of Tsar. But this is the socialist side. They went to Australia, nothing was good, and Matti Kurikka then got an invitation to come to British Columbia, and he established Sointula, which is the harmony in English, according to the very famous traditional one, harmony. There were about 1,000 people, a few years, 5 years about, and its end is also connected to the political changes in the world. His co-director was another journalist, actually, the editor-in-chief, second from the same newspaper of Työmies, which is workers. And Mäkelä, he was a communist, and Kurikka was some kind of utopian socialist. Mäkelä won, and Kurikka had to leave the community. He then went and established a new one in British Columbia, and he only took males because he thought that the reason for these conflicts were women. Only lasted about 1 year. Then Kurikka said that he was right, but he said wrongly. It was the problem with the men, not the female, and he tried to establish a community for women only. No women came. So that was end of Kurikka's era. And then these national people, they went to Canada, they went to the South America, Argentina, and to Cuba, and they tried to make mini Finland, small Finlands there. None of these lasted very long. The Argentinian was the greatest, about 500 people. The other ones were only plans or only had a few people. And in Cuba, they started as a national ones and they ended after a few years as socialist ones, because Finnish people living already in the US and Canada came and they were socialist mostly. So that happened in those countries. And then we come to the group which is the most strongest, and that's the cooperatives. Most of them were the United States, some also in Cuba. And here I like to mention the one established by Mackie Walsh, a Finnish-born business lady from Hancock, Michigan. He was at the time perhaps the richest Finnish person in the US, and certainly he is the most famous, well known even now. She was a businesswoman, she was very feminist, the first feminist suffragette, and she was also religious in a sect from Finland. And she brought about 300 people to the island of Drummond. It lasted and went pretty well. It was capitalistic community, in fact. But again happened what happened in Cuba, for instance, earlier. Socialists from Michigan and Minnesota area came and overtook the community, so it came to be very socialist for a few years before it went down. Also, you can see the name of Jim Jones. That's only just by fact, because in the same valley in California where the Finnish people came later, Jim Jones, you may remember that he went to Guyana then and made a real big sweet people were killed here in his sect. Some Finns also from the valley who had been in the colony before. And then we come to the very great colony, which is Soviet Union, of course, and it's not long ago that even I, and I think most of the people, believed that Soviet Union will be living forever, but it was an utopian and it had its end. The Finns, who were numerous in the US and Canada, and socialists, sometimes they even had a majority of the Communist Party in the US in the early days, and they wanted to go to help to build Soviet Union. It's called Karelian fever, because Karelia is the area of Finland against the Russian, an area that earlier was Finland, but then Soviet Union took it by war from us. But anyway, it was Soviet Karelia now, and they went to try to help there. And one group went even to the Rostov, close to the Black Sea, and they had with them tractors. They have even an airplane. They had lots of money. Because that was the idea that they go to help them. Now, we know these didn't last very long. Most of them in Karelia were very short, because when Stalin era started, Finnish people were one of the most sensitive group, and they were killed, simply. The one in Rostov area, it lasted longer because it was a good farm, but the Finnish people had mostly left it to the Karelia before, because there become to be also other nationalities to the Black Sea commune, and that was of course for the people a kind of mistake of life, because most of them lost their life then by Stalin. I visited this Rostov a few years ago, and there was still a Finnish man called Matti Tarhala living. He spoke Finnish, and so we call him the last Finn of that area. And then we come to not to Spanish, but close by, Alborada in Paraguay, Penedo in Brazil, Villavaca in Dominican Republic were all established by people who wanted to have warmth, who wanted to have also freedom from the Finnish church. and especially in the case of Dominican Republic, they also were wishing they did not accept vaccinations. That was the main reason for them to go to Dominican Republic. They all were about the same family in Finland, but then came competition. Penedo became the strongest one. It still exists, but the other ones were. And those who went to Penedo, they had to be vaccinated there. The Dominican Republic did not. Those lasted not very long, let's say about 10 years. And then they were down as most of the, if not nearly all, utopians go. So here we have already dealt with 19 Finnish communities. So let's summarize what they maybe teach to us. First of all, I have tried to calculate how many of the features of the traditional utopian communities like Oneida or New Harmony and so they seem to follow, and quite a few. Common housing, common meals, equal pay, common land owning, etc. become quite common. Sexual moral questions were only in a few of them, and own education for children also in not so many. Charismatic leader was in fact in all of them except one, and formal organization were quite borrowed from the traditional communities of the world. Important in the ideology were those features which I already mentioned, but also had to add that temperance movement, which was of course a folk movement at that time anywhere, was very important for most of them. And very common for all of these was also the idea that we go to back to the countryside and make agriculture. Bad thing was that in US and Canada they often happened to buy land that was not good for farming, or like in Dominican Republic, it was not possible. Really, they had to make seeds which they didn't know, and they were mostly academicians and so on, so they didn't know how to do. And of course, it was end of those. But there was one which was one thing that was common for all, and that was the Finnish net. Most of these places were very Finnish. They spoke Finnish language. They educated their children in Finnish language, and they even might sometimes call them New Finland. And so when they went down, there remained most often a few people, and so those towns have been called Finn towns, and there are still Finn towns. This doesn't show really all of that, which were Penedo in Brazil and Sointula in the British Columbia, and these are still Finnish in the sense that they use it as to get tourists to those places. That's how they remain Finnish even now. So the last is here. A Strelok member from the Vladivostok area, when he came back, he wrote a book, and he says that in his idea is now after the Strelok catastrophe that socialist or any other utopians are not possible because a man, all taken into the consideration, is a manager utopian society himself. And we know that most of even the older communes have gone down very quickly, and the only long time are religious things like Mennonites and Amishes and so on. So that's what we perhaps are learning of that. I'm now writing something about the new communities, eco-communities and will be interesting to see how far they are living and if their fate is the same than the Finnish ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Teuvo. I think we've got a fair amount of time for discussion. Hay un micrófono allí, no sé dónde anda el otro. Ah, tú querías hablar. Pensaba que tenías el micrófono. El micrófono está detrás del portátil, pero el otro...
Okay. I have two questions for actually the three speakers. I've found the three papers really interesting. These are actually two questions. The first one is for Renny, if I may. I found your conclusion that the future was not cancelled just stolen really compelling, and but it reminded me of a society mentioned by Milner in Locating Science Fiction, which was the New York Futurians, to which Isaac Asimov belonged, apparently in the years of the New Deal. And I remember that Milner stressed the New Deal leftist, even Marxist leanings of some members. So my question would be, is actually, when did the left become disengaged, if it has, from the space colony movement, and whether the left might be, focused on future projects in other fields, such as the Green New Deal, which is a very Earth-based project. So I wonder whether the future is maybe not cancelled, just it is a contested space as outer space itself. That is my question. And the second question concerns the other two presentations, especially the one about Finnish utopian communities, but also the Romanian Phalanstery. I was intrigued by your emphasis on the Finnish character from the title, from the approach. The Finnish character of these communities, even some of them described as mini Finlands. And I wonder, to which extent did these the members of these communities welcome foreigners or actually sought contact with foreigners besides helping Jews, helping slaves? Did they actually, and to what extent were these communities, and then the question also affects the one by Professor Antohi, were these communities actually Finnish? I mean, to what extent were they Finnish, or were they just projects from individual Finns? And the same applies to the Romanian Phalanstery. Was it a Romanian Phalanstery? I mean, to what extent was it a Romanian Phalanstery, or just a specific Phalanstery founded by Romanians? And that is, of course, a methodological question also for my own research about Spanish utopias, because one can consider them Spanish or just utopias designed by Spaniards.
Yes, if I can answer first this longer question. So the Finnish people went partly because they were Finns, but that was only the national ones. The other ones were for ideological reasons, and they very often went to the very faraway places where they didn't really have too many neighbors. If they were socialist, as most of them were, think of the one which went to Georgia USA, in the middle of the very right-wing people. Of course, they tried to keep very silent, and the Finnish language helped, of course. So otherwise, there would have been conflicts. But of course, they basically they had to intervene and to discuss with also with the other people. But the Finnish language, or the specific one which is spoken in the US, has a word in Finnish which means language people. It means that anyone who is not speaking Finnish but some other language. So that was the kind of contrast to the communities. Outside of the communities, they were the language people. So they were ideological people, but they were and they also kept the Finnish identity to the very end.
Renny, do you want to answer on the left and space, and then we'll go to Sorin?
Okay, thank you for the wonderful questions. So I would say that primarily the stance of the left broadly in the US towards space has been entirely negative. That the response has usually been something along the lines of, why should we pay for that? You know, when we begin fixing poverty on Earth or something, or, you know, why should we colonize Mars when we can't, you know, fix the environment on our own planet, et cetera, et cetera. Which, of course, I think is a very reasonable view, but it doesn't engage with the future, right? It's not a futuristic, it's an anti-futuristic kind of stance, right? And there were exceptions, Leary, for instance, this Harvard psychologist, Isaac Asimov, who are kind of embracing it, but they're also embracing it in this anti-big government, kind of more libertarian leftist sense, and it's not a particularly strong stance, I think. The broader left engagement with space is in the Soviet Union, of course, and in other communist countries, and there, of course, left means something very different, but that's sort of still a mystery exactly. You know, many of the people who are really the scientists and engineers and stuff in the Soviet space program, what exactly they intended in space is kind of vague. In the US, it's pretty clear that you know, there a lot of the American interest is military. It's about building spy satellites. It's about doing these other things. Space colonization is just kind of an excuse. Although for some people in NASA and whatever, it's a very legitimate thing. I think for a lot of people like Sergei Korolev, the sort of main leader of the Soviet space program, it was about space colonization, right? And in a very far off sense, but also that wasn't very difficult to imagine in sort of within communist ideology compared to, you know, American capitalism, which is just kind of can't reach that kind of level of futurism, right? And it can only do so, I think, in these kind of obscure neoliberal spaces. Yeah.
Sorin, do you want to comment on the aspects of Hugo's questions that sort of touched on Romania?
Yes. How Romanian are these people? Now, Romanian is let's say, a blanket word for a multiplicity of hybrid identities. Most of the people who were engaged in this operation were not according to strict nationalist ethnic standards, Romanian. Diamand himself, Diamand is an artificial name. He picked it up. His name was different, Mehtupciu, and this is a name that indicates a Balkan, a south of Danube origin, probably Albanian, probably maybe Vlahos, which is a kind of cousins of the Romanians. But he was a Romanian while he was on Romanian soil. He was studying in Romanian and Greek. At the time, in the 1820s, 40s, everybody with an education in the Romanian lands, excluding Transylvania, of course, which was under Hungarian and Habsburg domination, people were bilingual. They were with education. Then they would speak Romanian and Greek. As to their exact identities, that the other day somebody mentioned Nicolae Georgescu-Roegen. But his father was Greek. He picked up a Romanian name. He became Romanian, and he was socialized as a Romanian. His mother was Romanian. We thought he was. I have a Greek family name, by the way, of course. So this is a kind of a situation of fluid identities that change over time. They are only gradually nationalized in the nation-statal sense towards the end of the 19th century. So at the time of Diamand, this is too early to ask. Now, the Roma were there as some of the, not a majority, but a sizable portion of the population of the future, not just to these Roma reducciones that were proposed for the Principality of Moldavia, but also for the Scăieni Phalanstery itself. One of the, so to speak, self-interested donors for Scăieni, the main one, who was a crook, of course, he divorced his, let's say, Greek-Romanian wife, and he married a former gypsy slave. So these are fluid identities. This is what I would leave it this to that. But then, if I can interject just about the how leftist were the visions of the space expansion or of space exploration in communist countries outside the Soviet Union itself. In Romania, they were more or less apolitical. They were, of course, manipulated and instrumentalized by the party state. But as a veteran of that movement myself, of science fiction and science fiction studies, I can testify that people were pretty much apolitical. They would, do not forget that around the 1970, the vision of a non-ideological, apolitical future was spreading, right? The convergency of systems, the idea that both systems of the Cold War were pretty much going to the same, destination in different ways. So the political, doctrinal, ideological dimensions of it have to be carefully studied. In Poland, for instance, if you take Stanislaw Lem, Solaris, right? So this is a kind of vision that transcends, that is meta-political in, let's say, the 1930s way, but even more so, it is almost post-human and looks into a very distant future for which the Soviet authors themselves, building sometimes on the very, very, very rich utopian traditions in Russia, were suggesting from the 1920s on, when it is dangerous to talk too much about something near the present, about very distant futures, very, very long timelines, at the end of which, whether or not that was communism remained to be more or less debated.
Thank you. Do we have any more comments or questions? Yeah, Renny, please.
I have a question about Finland and the Finnish. In my experience of these utopian communities in the US and elsewhere that were Jewish, they were often leaving, they went to America, in part because there was this sense of land of opportunity, where they would be able to build these communities. And in part, it seemed like it was kind of an attempt to escape their own history, right? And to go to a place where Jews had not been and do things that Jews had not done, right? To do agricultural utopian communities. In your experience, why was it that people left Finland to do this? Why did they build these communities in, Syria alone and not in Finland?
The Finns left because they were socialists and communists, and they were helping. They already had been. They went from Finland to the U.S. They had even made money, some of them, and then they decided that they will help the great utopia, and so they went to the Soviet Union and tried to do that. They didn't really expect what were going to happen over there. So I think that was quite simple, and you may know that, or some of you may know that the Soviet government had offices in the U.S. Technical help of Soviet or something, which were trying, they were channeling the people. It was not only Finnish immigrants who went to it was mostly, of course, other nations, other people from the US and Canada. I know other Baltic countries, Italians, Germans, etc. But I have been also, only looking at those places which were originally, some of them completely Finnish, and then later on perhaps they took also members, other members, many of whom were coming from US or Canada. And of course some people went directly from Finland to the Soviet, but that was smaller part.
Any other comments or questions?
Say something.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, okay, I don't hear you, but
Can you hear me now? Yes,
yeah,
please do go ahead.
I don't, two things. One, Jews from Romania, from an area of Romania where I was born, the little township of Moinești. Of course, they left Romania at a time when Zionism was trying to persuade people to go to Palestine. Of course, they didn't know anything about Palestine. They had no utopia in mind. But the Zionists were smart enough to know that these guys, being very deeply religious, they would immediately jump at the opportunity of going to the Holy Land to wait for Messiah. So they were totally mistaken upon when they went on foot, by the way, and many of them barefoot because they are quite poor, all the way to Palestine to, to wait, like the Tupi-Guaranis, who were crossing the Andes. We know this from this extraordinary study by Eliade on utopian mythology and eschatology of the Guaranis. They were crossing the Andes because they were not sure not only about the moment when Messiah comes, but about the exact place where Messiah comes. So the shamans would tell them, you go there, and so forth. They would die along the way. So this is one thing. Now, there is a possibility of looking at extreme right wing, including Nazi, intentional communities in Latin America after the collapse of Nazi Germany. Prior to that, and there also was a process of contamination ideological. I'm talking about this during the pandemic, of course, using these rough metaphors. They were, for instance, radical right Romanians who had to flee Romania after the collapse of right-wing Romania in 1944. They went to the United States, where they joined traditional Romanian communities of emigre Romanians from late 19th century. And they found shelter there during the very anti-communist policy, immigration policy, and general politics of the US administration in the 50s and 60s. So the Iron Guard itself, the extreme right wing in Romania, survived at least, how shall I say, bovarically and, passively in the Midwest, in Chicago and in the Midwest, decades after their history and their motherland had been finished. So finished with just one N, right? So not finished with two N's. We have to see some of these, the bad, let's say, the dark intentional communities. We have lionized intentional communities. We have loved them. We presented mostly beautiful examples, but we shouldn't forget about the dark, negative, somber intentional communities, which in many ways may be more intentional than others, because these people simply have to run away from something. Whether they go for something in the future, that remains to be seen, but obviously they have to escape from something, and this is an extraordinary incentive to build up an intentional community. Thank you.
And here I'm probably people who know better than I do, but I have also been finding that to the many places in the South America where the Finns went, there were also Jewish communities, like in Paraguay, Mennonites who were actually the only friendly sect to the Ericssons who went there sailing in Europe. They also had been going to the South America, and some of their settlements in South America are still remaining somehow. And of course we know that they also went to the Canada and USA in masses. But even in Soviet Union there used to be, and I still, at least formally still is, an area of Jews, which is close to Vladivostok. So that was an area where even Stalin wanted to have more people, Russian people, to living in, because he was afraid of China and Korea, like the Tsar was in his time.
I wonder, Renny, can I ask you about a couple of questions about space and the US? I suppose one question is sort of the relationship of the left to science fiction as opposed to science fact and tech. So obviously space is the place and so on in the 60s, and that carries on to a certain extent through science fiction. And I suppose to what extent you think the left continues with its interest in space through science fiction, or abandons it, or and how is that connected to its interest in tech or not? And I suppose sort of passing through the image of William Shatner floating around in a vessel, the question of whether L5 has a direct legacy. Are people like Elon Musk interested in it, or have they just forgotten about that and started again?
Have they forgotten about the leftist sort of angle, you mean?
No, have they forgotten about L5 and that kind of earlier rightist view?
No, I would say that, I mean, I don't know what these, Elon Musk thinks, it's, who knows. But it's certainly among these kind of space enthusiasts now who are involved in those projects and in all of these different small interest groups that sort of are backing him and these other people, they're very much aware of it, and they very much see themselves in a long trajectory of this, that this wasn't an idea they just came up with 5 years ago. They've been building it for a long time. A lot of them see, and they see themselves as apolitical in a way. I mean, sometimes they identify as capitalists, right? But most of the time they see themselves just sort of liberatory, whatever. And so that allows them to recognize leftist sort of angles. A lot of times when talking about space colonization, the first person these people mention, and this was true in the L5 Society, was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Russian, later Soviet father of astronautics, who is sort of broadly a utopian socialist, maybe. And so that very much is there. And then the science fiction aspect is huge. I mean, I think science fiction is inspiration for a lot of these people, right? And certainly they mention it all of the time. Yeah, I've also written another paper on a guy who was a higher up in Air Force intelligence in the U.S. and sort of a crazy utopian guy, and he laid out the plans to build in the 1950s the spy satellite network that we have now, and he had this incredibly utopian sort of space age idea about reorienting all in political hegemony around spies and their sort of space power, which is kind of what happened, right? And one of his inspiration was Buck Rogers. Right, and he mentions Buck Rogers alongside Mao as one of his inspirations. So there certainly is this on both sides, I think, interest in science fiction, and science fiction is a very direct, political inspiration for what they're doing. As far as what people are doing now, I think there's certainly a reinterest in space for people like Kim Stanley Robinson, right, and sort of interest in theorizing space from a leftist angle again, not necessarily through utopianism, right, but reimagining it from a leftist perspective, which I think is very important. Yeah.
Do we have any more comments? Oh,
I was just wondering about this science fiction kind of tradition linked to activism. There was this association of autonomous astronauts, which were linked to the social justice global movement, to the anti-globalization movement. And I was wondering if you know about them, because I read about them, I've seen some stuff, but I've always found it very cryptic in knowing what the materialization was.
I don't know anything about it, but it sounds really interesting. If you have any readings to show me, I'd love to see. Yeah.
It was this idea of self-managing the space race and kind of squatting space in a way.
Mm-hmm. And these were astronauts from where?
They were a British group, and I don't know if they were astronauts. I think they were not.
Oh, I see.
But there was
Okay.
about this reclaiming space.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's very interesting. I think that we imagine sort of the space race as the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, right? And in reality, of course, it was more complicated as the Cold War was more complicated, and constantly European space programs and other space programs were being pissed off by the United States, in part because of its kind of crazy power politics, and the Space Lab or one of the other space stations that was funded by the U.S. and various European space agencies, and after they sent it into the sky, the U.S. said, "Oh, by the way, we own it completely. You have no control over it whatsoever," and these kind of things. And it was constantly causing people, causing stress. It caused, I believe, like the French space agency began cooperating more with the Soviets rather than the U.S. because they were so annoyed about these things. And so I think after beginning in the 1960s, there's more space for these more of a place for these kind of imaginations and whatever outside of sort of the hegemony of the American space program, which is incredibly conservative, right, and very much about building power. Yeah, but I don't know about that particular group, but there are similar sort of groups as well, I think, that grew up in different areas in those spaces. Yeah.
Also, regarding the last presentation, you said that you were writing about more ecological communities. I just wanted to ask that, and also how you started researching on these intentional communities from Finland.
Sorry, can you speak without the mask? I didn't get any.
Yes, these are two questions. One is about how you started researching on these Finnish intentional communities. And the second one is about, you said you were writing on more ecological intentional communities, and I just wanted to ask what you were researching in this direction.
Yes, I visited most of these Finnish utopian communities around the world in 1980s. And then I wrote a book about them. Because I first went to the Sointula, which is in Canada, and that's well known by the Canadians and not only by the Finns. And only there I understood that it's not a unique question of one Sointula or harmony, but there were many. Then I took it like a personal challenge, and I went to many of them. I have been trying to revisit them. Most of them I did, but then came Corona, so I still have grant to go to the South America, but I don't know if I ever go there. I will write this in a new edition of my book, and also I will be opening a site next year, Finn Utopias, which will have all the text of my book, but hundreds of photographs, which I have been collected now for 30 years at least. And also I'm now interested of two things, which eco-communities. I have already, I was interviewing yesterday Los Portales here, but I will also visit of some of them, because last year I happened to be in January in the US, and I was able to go to, I think, about 10 communities over there. So I have now material to compare the US one, some from here and some from Finland. So that's another area. And the third one is, which I actually wanted to ask for Renny, between ground and space. It means virtual world. Do you think that virtual communities would some way to be for people to live in the future in a bubbles, big bubbles, and would that be some solution? I don't know if there is really any more the threat that globe will be too much people, because it seems that the number of people doesn't go up like that anymore, but even goes. So we do have space, and we have also these new commune of virtual realities and virtual etc. How do you feel about that?
It's an interesting question. I think that in the 70s, as I was trying to show, a lot of the ideas about space were transformed by the particular social concerns of that moment, right? And one of which was this sense of overpopulation as a new thing, right? And needing to, that overpopulation would run rampant. There wasn't this idea yet that the curve would go down, really. And so we had to find a space to send people, and that was space, the energy crisis, of course, and these different things. Now I think the ideas about space colonization now are very much inflected by our current concerns, right? Mostly environmental collapse, in the sense that, many people are advocating for going to Mars, or advocating in the sense that there we can build a new environment that'll be better than this environment. We won't pollute our own environment. There were similar concerns in the 70s with the growing ecological movement. It wasn't quite the same sense of climate change as there is now, but certainly that is part of it. As for the digital communities, or whatever you would call them, I don't know that much about it, but certainly I think a lot of people within the actual sort of within NASA, within the Russian Space Agency, within these other things, are much more interested in not sending people anymore up into space, partly because of financial reasons. They've been hamstrung by their own governments and stuff, and it's too expensive to send people, and in part because you can do a lot more with robots, right? And the robots have become so much more sophisticated, and drones, and you can do way more things now with them. And so I think that does raise a lot of questions about sort of, will our relationship with space be digital, right? Will we not really be there in person, but will we be sending things? Whatever. Yeah, it's hard to say. Yeah.
Anything further, or are we? I think that's us. We're finishing just about 10 minutes early. I think we're going to resume at 3:30. Is that right? ¿Cómo quieres? Sí. Pues perfecto, entonces volvemos a las 3:30 en punto, ¿no? 3:30 en punto. Pues muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much to our three participants, both for your papers and for that excellent discussion.
Thank you.